20th century was the most violent and bloodiest century in the recorded history of mankind. It was a strife-torn and war-ravaged century, witnessing two world wars within the span of first 45 years, causing the death of almost 90 million souls. While the later half of this century was marred by the Cold War between two superpowers that emerged from the rubble of the Second World War, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. However, both these superpowers were astute enough not to engage in direct military confrontation with each other. The origins of this Cold War may very well be traced back to the agreements that the Allies made regarding the future of liberated Europe and control of Germany. The Allies met thrice at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam to discuss the steps to be taken after the war was over. Out of the three meetings, the one at Yalta was perhaps the most significant. It was here that it was decided to divide Germany into four occupation zones, one each under the Soviet Union, the United States of America, Great Britain, and France, while Berlin, which fell into the Russian occupied zone, to also be divided along the same lines. The Allies had also agreed to hold free elections in the countries of Eastern Europe after the war. But by the time of Potsdam Conference, which was held in July 1945, it had become clear that Stalin had no intentions of honoring those agreements. At Potsdam Conference, the main disagreement occurred over Poland. Truman and Churchill were annoyed because Germany east of Oder-Neisse line had been occupied by Russian troops and was being run by a pro-communist Polish government, which expelled some 5 million Germans living in the area. This had not been agreed to at Yalta. In the months following the Potsdam Conference, the Russians systematically interfered in the countries of Eastern Europe to set up pro-communist governments. This happened in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, and Romania. In addition to the Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe, the West was further frightened by Stalin because of his widely reported speech, in which he said that communism and capitalism cannot exist together peacefully and future wars were inevitable until the final victory of communism. It was Churchill who responded to this in his Sinews of Peace speech in March 1946 at Fulton, Missouri, in which he used the phrase, "From Staten and Baltic to Trieste and Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." He claimed that the Russians were bent on indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines and called for a Western alliance which would stand firm against the communist threat. The entire Eastern Europe was inundated by the tide of communism. Europe now had 7 countries which were dominated by communist parties. USA found these developments to be extremely troublesome and viewed them as a danger to democratic system all around the world. While the Soviet Union was tightening its grip over Eastern Europe, a civil war was raging in Greece, where the communists were trying to overthrow the monarchy. British troops who had helped liberate Greece from the Germans in 1944 had restored monarchy, but they were now feeling the strain of supporting it against the communists, who were receiving help from Yugoslavia. So they appealed to USA for help. It was under these circumstances that the US President Harry S. Truman declared that USA would support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. The Truman Doctrine made it clear that the USA had no intention of returning to isolation as she had after the First World War. She was committed to a policy of containing communism, not just in Europe, but throughout the world, including Korea and Vietnam. Truman Doctrine, which also subsumed the concept of containment as propounded by George Kennan, was to form the keystone of US foreign policy during the Cold War era, and it was the pursuit of this policy that would lead to US involvement in wars in Korea and Vietnam. First major crisis of Cold War unfolded in Germany. It arose out of disagreements over the treatment of Germany. At the end of the war, as agreed at Yalta and Potsdam, Germany and Berlin were each divided into 4 zones. While the three Western powers did their best to organize the economic and political recovery of their zones, Stalin, determined to make Germany pay for all the damage inflicted on Russia, treated his zone as a satellite, draining its resources away to Russia. By the early 1948, the three Western zones were merged together to form a single economic unit, whose prosperity thanks to Marshall aid was in marked contrast to the poverty of the Russian zone. The West wanted all four zones to be reunited and given self government as soon as possible. But Stalin had decided that it would be safer for Russia if he kept the Russian zone separate with its own communist and pro Russian government. In June 1948, the West introduced a new currency and ended price controls in their zone and in West Berlin. The Russians decided that the situation in Berlin had now become impossible, as the city of Berlin, which fell in the Russian zone, now had two different currencies. And the stark contrast between the prosperity of West Berlin and poverty of the surrounding area was a major cause of embarrassment to the Soviet Union. So the Russians retaliated by closing all road, rail, and canal links between West Berlin and West Germany, thinking that the West would withdraw from Berlin. But contrary to their expectations, over the next 10 months, 2 million tons of supplies were airlifted to the blockaded city in a remarkable operation, which kept the 2.5 million West Berliners fed and warm right through the winter. In May 1949, the Russians finally admitted their failure and lifted the blockade. The Berlin blockade served as an eye opener to the West European nations, for it made them realize that they were not sufficiently prepared to face a belligerent Soviet Union. And this gave birth to North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was signed in April 1949. And the Western powers also realized that there was no prospect of the Russians allowing a united Germany, so they went ahead and set up the German Federal Republic, also known as West Germany, in August 1949. The Russians replied by setting up their zone as the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, in October 1949. Germany was to remain divided until 1990. Some other significant events took place in the year 1949 that further damaged the already worsening relationship between the USSR and USA. In September 1949, the USSR successfully exploded an atomic bomb, and arms race began in earnest. Truman responded by giving the go-ahead for the USA to produce a hydrogen bomb. In October 1949, a communist government was proclaimed in China after the communist leader Mao Zedong defeated Chiang Kai-shek. And when the USSR and Communist China signed a Treaty of Alliance in February 1950, American fears of an advancing tide of communism seemed about to be realized. It was in this atmosphere of American anxiety that the Cold War spotlight was now shifted to Korea. Korea had been under Japanese occupation since 1910. When the Japanese were defeated in August 1945, the USA and the USSR agreed to divide the country into two zones along the 38th parallel, so that they could jointly organize the Japanese surrender and withdrawal, Russians in the north and Americans in the south. This division was not intended to be a permanent one. However, the unification of Korea, like that of Germany, soon became part of Cold War rivalry, and no agreement could be reached. Elections were held in South supervised by the UN, and the Independent Republic of Korea, or South Korea, was set up with Syngman Rhee as president in August 1948. The following month, the Russians created the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, under the communist government of Kim Il sung. In June 1950, North Korean troops invaded South Korea without any warning, and by September they had captured the whole country except the southeast around the port of Busan. It was at this time that America decided to intervene in this war, as President Truman was convinced that the attack was Stalin's doing. And he decided that it was essential that instead of just economic help and promises of support, the West should take stand by supporting South Korea. American troops in Japan were ordered to Korea even before UN had decided what action to take. And on 15th of September, American Marines landed at Incheon near Seoul. Then followed an incredibly swift collapse of North Korean forces, and by the end of September, UN troops had entered Seoul and cleared the south of communists. But instead of ordering a ceasefire, Truman ordered an invasion of North Korea with UN approval. And this development alarmed China greatly, for they believed that Americans would now invade Manchuria. So in November, the Chinese launched a massive counteroffensive with over 300,000 troops, described as volunteers, and by mid-January 1951, they had driven the UN troops out of North Korea, crossed the 38th parallel, and captured Seoul again. Truman did not want to provoke a large-scale war, So he decided to settle for merely containing communism. In June, UN troops cleared the communists out of South Korea again and fortified the frontier. Peace talks opened in Panmunjom and lasted for 2 years, ending in July 1953, with an agreement that the frontier should be roughly along the 38th parallel. By July 1953, when the armistice between North Korea and South Korea was signed, Stalin was dead and had been replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. On the other hand, Dwight D. Eisenhower had become the new president of United States of America, replacing Harry S. Truman, and it was expected that the relationship between the two countries might improve. But Khrushchev's policy was a curious mixture. While on the one hand, Russia under his command made important concessions like giving up their military bases in Finland and lifting their veto on admission of 16 new member states to the UN, they had no intention of relaxing Russia's grip on the satellite states. The Hungarians discovered this to their cost in 1956, when a rising in Budapest against the communist government was ruthlessly crushed by Russian tanks. Under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, Warsaw Pact was signed in 1955 between Russia and the satellite states, shortly after West Germany was admitted to NATO. The pact was a mutual defense agreement, which the West took as a gesture against West Germany's membership of NATO. In 1958, Khrushchev announced that the USSR no longer recognized the rights of the Western powers in West Berlin. And when the Americans made it clear that they would resist any attempt to push them out, Khrushchev did not press the point. However, in 1961, Khrushchev again suggested, this time to the new president, John F. Kennedy, that the West should withdraw from Berlin. And when Kennedy refused, the Berlin Wall was erected in August 1961, a 28-mile-long monstrosity across the entire city. Amidst all these events, the arms race between the USSR and USA was also accelerating. And although by the end of 1949 the Russians had produced their own atomic bomb, the Americans already had a big lead in bombs of this type. But the Russians were determined to catch up, even though the production of nuclear weapons placed an enormous strain on their economy. And when the Americans made the much more powerful hydrogen bomb towards the end of 1952, the Russians did the same the following year and had soon developed a bomber with a range long enough to reach the USA. The Americans remained well ahead in numbers of nuclear bombs and bombers, but it was the Russians who took the lead in August 1957 when they produced a new type of weapon, the intercontinental ballistic missile. This was a nuclear warhead carried by a rocket so powerful that it could reach the USA even when fired from inside the USSR. Not to be outdone, the Americans soon produced their version of an ICBM known as Atlas. And before long, they had many more than the Russians. The Americans also began to build nuclear missiles with a shorter range. These were known as Jupiters and Thors, and they could reach USSR from launching sites in Europe and Turkey. But the Soviet Union had no such bases as that of USA, and her missile sites were within her own territory. So when USSR decided to install nuclear missiles in Cuba, it led to one of the most serious crises in the history of post-Second World War era. Cuba became involved in the Cold War in 1959 when Fidel Castro, who had just seized power from the corrupt American-backed dictator Batista, outraged the USA by nationalizing American-owned estates and factories. And as Cuba's relationship with USA worsened, those with the USSR improved. The United States of America broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba in January 1961. John F. Kennedy, the new US president, was convinced that Cuba was now a communist state in all but name. So he approved a plan by a group of Batista supporters to invade Cuba from American bases in Guatemala. A small invading force of about 1,400 men landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. But the operation was so badly planned and carried out that Castro's forces and his two jet planes had no difficulty in crushing it. After the fiasco of Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy openly declared that we do not intend to abandon Cuba to the communists, and he continued his campaign to destroy Castro in various ways. Cuban merchant ships were sunk, installations on the island were sabotaged, and American troops carried out invasion exercises. It was under these circumstances that Castro appealed to the USSR for military help. Under the pretext of helping Castro, Khrushchev decided to set up nuclear missile launchers in Cuba aimed at the USA. He intended to install missiles with a range of up to 2,000 miles, which meant that all the major cities of the central and eastern USA would be under threat. This was a risky decision, and there was a great consternation in the USA when in October 1962, photographs taken from the spy planes showed a missile base under construction in Cuba. Khrushchev justified his decision on the basis that in 1959 the Americans had signed an agreement with Turkey allowing them to deploy Jupiter nuclear missiles from bases in Turkey. Although Kennedy's military advisors urged him to launch airstrikes against the bases, he acted more cautiously. He alerted the American troops and began a blockade of Cuba to keep out the 25 Russian ships which were bringing missiles to Cuba. The situation was tense and the world seemed to be on the verge of a nuclear war. But Khrushchev, to his credit, made the first move and ordered the Russian ships to turn back. And eventually a compromise solution was reached. Khrushchev promised to remove the missiles and dismantle the sites. In return, Kennedy promised that USA would not invade Cuba again and undertook to disarm the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Although potential disaster was averted in Cuba, both USA and USSR, because of the adherence to their ideologies, were to get embroiled in conflicts in other parts of the world. In 1945, after the end of Second World War, Ho Chi Minh declared the whole of Vietnam independent. But the French, whose colony it was before the Second World War, had no intention of allowing full independence. And hostilities soon broke out between the League of Vietnamese Independence and the French. The French position in Vietnam soon became untenable against the resistance shown by the Ho Chi Minh-led League of Vietnamese Independence, which, by employing guerrilla warfare, outsmarted the French and finally decimated them in May 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. Soon after this, by Geneva Agreement, Vietnam was temporarily divided into two states at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's government was recognized in North Vietnam, and South Vietnam was to have a separate government for the time being. But elections were to be held in July 1956 for the whole country, which would then become united. As it turned out, the elections were never held, and the whole of Vietnam plunged into a civil war, with South Vietnam being supported by the USA, as the incumbent US president of the time, Eisenhower, was obsessed with his domino theory, according to which if one country of the region fell to communism, it would quickly knock over the next one in line. By 1960, various opposition groups, which included many former communist members of the Viet Minh, formed the National Liberation Front and demanded a democratic national coalition government. A guerrilla campaign also began attacking government officials and buildings. USA, which up till now had been supporting the Go Din Diem regime in South with economic aid and military advisors, now felt a strong stand must be made, especially after their failure to stem the communist tide in China, Cuba and Korea. The Americans were further strengthened in their resolve by the knowledge that the Viet Cong were receiving supplies, equipments and troops from North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh believed that such aid was justified. After all, it was the USA and the South who were refusing to be bound by the Geneva Agreements. And given South Vietnam's refusal to agree to national elections, only force could unite the two halves of the country. Both Kennedy and his successor Lyndon Johnson were prepared to go further than just economic aid and advisors. In public, the Americans said their intervention was to protect the independence of Vietnamese people. But the real reason was to keep the country securely in the non-communist bloc. The US started sending her own troops, to begin with as military advisors, but gradually as regular combat troops. By the end of 1967, the number of US troops fighting in Vietnam had gone up to 500,000. It has been estimated that by 1967, the power of bombs dropped on Vietnamese territory by the US exceeded that of the bombs dropped all over Europe during the entire period of the Second World War. The US war in Vietnam was the most unpopular US war in history. It was condemned by people all over the world, including in the United States. No other single event in the years after 1945 had united people all over the world as the opposition to the war in Vietnam. The US troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1973. And by April 1975, the South Vietnamese army was routed and the last of the US advisors also left. Vietnam was at last united and free from foreign intervention under a communist government. In the same year, communist governments were also established in Laos and Cambodia. The American policy of preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia had ended in complete failure. While USA was engaged in war in Vietnam, the Russians were also facing a stiff resistance in Czechoslovakia against the established norms of a communist government. After their military intervention in Hungary, the Russians did not interfere so directly anywhere until 1968, when they felt that the Czechs were straying too far from the accepted communist line. The matters came to head in January 1968, when pro-Moscow communist Antonin Novotny was forced to resign and Alexander Dubček became first secretary of the Communist Party. Dubček and his supporters had a completely new program, which involved decentralization of industry, more trade with the West, and freedom of speech and freedom of press. During the spring and summer of 1968, this program was carried into operation. The Russians became more and more worried by it, and in August there was a massive invasion of Czechoslovakia by Russian, Polish, Bulgarian, Hungarian, and East German troops. The Czech government decided not to resist so as to avoid the sort of bloodshed which had occurred in Hungary in 1956. Although the states of Eastern Europe seemed on the surface to be firmly under Russian control, resentment against Moscow's hard lines simmered on, especially in Poland and Czechoslovakia. In the short period between August 1988 and December 1991, communism in Eastern Europe was swept away. Poland was the first to reject communism, closely followed by Hungary and East Germany and the rest. Until by the end of 1991, even Russia had ceased to be communist after 74 years. The end, when it came quickly. Remarkable events happened in Eastern Europe in the period between 1988 to December 1991. Communism was swept away by a rising tide of popular opposition and mass demonstrations, far more quickly than anybody could have ever imagined. Grassroots organizations such as Poland's Solidarity Movement rapidly gained ground with strong popular bases. In February 1989, the Polish People's Republic opened talks with opposition, known as the Polish Round Table Agreement, which allowed elections with participation of anti-communist parties in June 1989. The initially inconspicuous opening of a border gate of the Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary in August 1989 then triggered a chain reaction, at the end of which the German Democratic Republic no longer existed, and the Eastern Bloc had disintegrated. The idea for the pan-European picnic came from Otto von Habsburg and was intended as a test to whether the Soviet Union would react when the Iron Curtain was opened. The non-reaction of the Eastern Bloc states showed the oppressed population that their governments had lost absolute power. The tidal wave of change culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, which symbolized the collapse of European communist governments and graphically ended the Iron Curtain divide of Europe. The collapse of the Eastern European governments with Gorbachev's tacit consent inadvertently encouraged several Soviet republics to seek greater independence from Moscow's rule. Agitation for independence in the Baltic states led to first Lithuania and then Estonia and Latvia declaring their independence. Disaffection in the other republics was met by promises of greater decentralization. More open elections led to the election of candidates opposed to Communist Party rule. On December 1, 1991, Ukraine withdrew from the USSR. On December 26, 1991, the USSR officially dissolved, breaking up into 15 separate nations, and thus ended the Cold War.